Hello, everybody. Happy Friday and welcome to VML Season 6. My name's Haiyue and I'm here with Arya, Karamchandani. We are bringing you week 4 action here at the VML. And before we get into it, we'd love to, of course, thank our awesome sponsors, Wizards of the Coast, for making the VML possible, and our WPN store partner, NRG Series, who actually have a really cool live in-person event happening this weekend. I believe it's a team multi-format event happening in Chicago. So check out NRG Series for news about how you can join their upcoming tournaments. Arya, it's week 4. It's time. We're in the middle of the season. What are your thoughts so far?
Well, I'm really excited to see how the next few weeks start shaping up. We're at that point where people are starting to, think about like whether the playoffs are guaranteed, where your standing is within your bracket. So, like these are some really important matches in terms of positioning within going into the playoffs. So I'm really excited to see how they play out. And there's a bunch of really interesting decks too that I'm really looking forward to seeing.
Well, speaking of the decks, we don't have a metagame slide for all of you this week, but we can talk a little bit about what everyone brought. Do you have any broad thoughts on what people chose to bring to the tournament this week?
Yeah, I mean, we're seeing a lot more brewing with Crimson Vow having come out. A lot of new decks that haven't been tested and haven't been proven either one way or the other. So a lot of people experimenting with things, a lot more diversity than we might have seen in the metagame, say, 2 weeks ago, with just a bunch of Izzet mono white and mono green. There's a lot of different decks, and I'm excited to figure out which ones of them actually end up being good enough to make the cut.
Well, we can find out together, Arya. Let's have a look at our first featured match of the evening. And I think this one's actually coming from your division, Arya, from division number 8, which, not gonna lie, myself and Caroline have been referring to secretly and incredibly happily as the group of death that we're not in. We have VML caster and OXG member Skybilz coming in with mono white aggro. Tell us about this particular build.
This build of mono white is fairly standard and, well, proven to be really, really strong. The deck is, with Talia, the deck got a strong new tool from Crimson Vow, and it's kind of hard for the more controlling decks to beat it now. The deck does a really good job going under them. And yeah, it's a little soft sometimes to mid-rangey decks, but it's proven to be really good against controlling decks and pretty good against the other low to the ground decks because of the removal speed it has. So just generally a really well-positioned deck right now.
Let's have a look at the other side of the matchup. We have Skybilz, who's currently, I believe, at 1-2 in the tournament, going up against, it's another member of the casting team. It's Beky Bear. Beky coming with Dimir control. This one, we have seen a few Dimir control builds here and there. Is this all that different to what we were seeing, towards the end of the Midnight Hunt Standard?
A little bit. The deck got one huge new tool in Hullbreaker Horror. Hullbreaker Horror gives the deck a tool to go over the top in the late game that Dimir control decks previously didn't have. Previously, it was just Izzet that was restricted to going over the top with Alrund's Epiphany, whereas Dimir control just had to hope to play counter spells and get by. But Hullbreaker Horror changes that because, well, it's uncounterable. It lets you interact a bunch. It allows Dimir to go over the top of both aggressive and controlling decks into the late game without really needing a multiple card suite like Galvanic Iteration and Alrund's Epiphany.
All right, well, let's find out who is going to come out on top in this classic aggro versus a control matchup. We do have Skybilz on the lower half of your screen with mono white on the draw against Beky on the upper half. And this opening hand for Sky, Hopeful Initiate, Usher, Luminarch, Aspirant, Thalia, the threats, Portable Hole, that one doesn't do quite as much in this matchup as you would want it to.
Yeah, that said, it's still a hand I'd be very, very happy from Skybilz's side. Thalia is one of the best cards in the deck, and so any one drop into Thalia is just a really, really strong start against a deck like Dimir. So it seems like a pretty good 7.
Wow, look at this. Beky, respecting the Usher, actually going to use an Infernal Grasp, which is a premium piece of removal here on that Usher of the Fallen.
Yeah, the Dimir deck is slightly incentivized to main phase removal where possible, particularly when the threat you most want to kill onto is Thalia, which Infernal Grasp can't kill onto. There's the threat of something like Valorous Stance blowing you out if you wait too long, so there's no reason to not go for removal as early as possible.
So we see Beky find a copy of Go Blank that joins the Celestis, Divide by Zero, Memory Deluge, and Alia. So Beky is kind of faced with a bit of a choice here. Do you spend this turn using your Divide by Zero, or are you going to try and develop some mana? And it looks like Beky is going to just leave up this Divide by Zero for now.
Yeah, I think it's fairly important to spend a turn interacting for Beky in a spot like this. She can't afford to fall too far behind, but it's certainly awkward given that there's no land for that Lier in hand, and Becky's kind of going to need to land that Lier to be able to get into a spot where she can actually start to approach parity at board.
So Divide is going to send this Intrepid Adversary back to hand, and we're going to see a big attack in now with the team for Skybilz. Beky is down to 8 already, finds a copy of Fading Hope. That is not a land. Environmental Sciences is available, but wow, the power of Thalia, Guardian of Thraben, just making Beky's hand look just embarrassingly clunky.
Yeah, and on top of that, you see Fading Hope. That's in the Dimir deck primarily for a matchup like Mono Green, where you want to be able to bounce the large threats like Old Growth Troll and try and get some sort of tempo advantage in that way. But not at its best against Mono White, because even if that Thalia gets bounced, it's just going to come back in a turn or two, and as a larger creature, come back in a turn or two for just 2 mana. And start taxing once again.
And with this attack, Skybilz is going to take Beky's life total down to 1. Basic Swamp not going to help out at this point in time. And we're going to see Beky scoop it up. So pretty easy 1-2-3 there for Skybilz and taking on game 1 against Dimir Control. Did that go the way that you thought it would, Arya?
Pretty much, yeah. The Dimir Control deck is forced to run some slightly clunky mid and top end cards like that Celestis and Go Blank we saw in hand to be able to contend with Izzet control decks, but that does leave the deck a little vulnerable to aggressive decks like Mono White.
Let's get a closer look here at the specific build of Mono White that Skybilz brought this week in particular. Gavany Dawnguard is a pretty interesting sideboard card here for this Mono White deck. We've seen people try out, Welcoming Vampire in that slot, Guardian of Faith. Why Gavany Dawnguard?
What Dawnguard has going for it is essentially it's one of the few ways you can get a recurring card advantage, particularly against the blue-red controlling decks. One thing Dawnguard does for you is it lets you play it out and then take turns off to do things like activate Faceless Haven without falling far behind because you're going to be getting card advantage. And while the 3 toughness isn't particularly relevant against blue-black, against blue-red it is a relevant number when Cinder Claws was dealing 2 damage. On top of that, the Ward 1 makes it hard for blue-red to efficiently answer it without trading down on mana. So a combination of those things makes Dawnguard quite good against controlling decks like Izzet, and just a source of recurring card advantage to let you fight a long game better.
So game number 2, players shuffling up. We see a copy of Crippling Fear in the hand for Beky. That one can be pretty brutal against these creature decks.
Yeah, definitely something Beky will be leaning on, though perhaps not quite as strong as board wipes might have been game 1, because we saw Skybilz bringing in Guardian of Fates to help protect from board wipes and Redains to make the board wipes cost more, so they can sometimes be a little clunky post board. And Crippling Fear particularly can't kill Adeline, which is really, really important.
Skybilz also has found a pair of Elite Spellbinders, so that's going to be able to take a look at Beky's hand and tax one of these spells in it for an extra 2 mana. Elite Spellbinder is so potent in these slower matchups for mono white.
Yeah, and one of Spellbinder's biggest weaknesses against controlling decks is board wipes like Syndiclasm clear it up for not much mana. But against blue-black, all the board wipes are things like Crippling Fear and Shadow's Verdict, which are already quite expensive and are not clearing the Spellbinder up at instant speed. So the card definitely puts a lot of pressure on the more controlling blue-black deck because it just slows down whatever their best piece of interaction at the time is.
Here's Benevolent Geist now out of the graveyard for Beky. And this is a trend that we have actually seen control players, dip into, which is Malevolent Hermit. Usually you think of this as you want it in the mirror, you want it against your Epiphany decks, but not too shabby when it can block essentially 2 creatures with 1 card.
Yeah. You notice there's a copy of Fading Hope in Beky's hand, and that's generally not ideal against a lot of mono white decks because you don't really want to be trading down on cards when they can redeploy their threats pretty cheaply and efficiently. But the Malevolent Hermits really do a good job helping to recoup that card disadvantage by trading 2 for 1 with the things that you're going down on cards to return to hand.
The Spellbinder comes down. That's going to take the Soul Shattered. That's, of course, the second Spellbinder that we've seen. And there is that Bloodchief's Thirst that Beky actually scried to the top. So this game looking a lot better for Beky in terms of, being able to maintain a high life total. But she does need to find some more action pretty soon.
Yeah, we mentioned that Crippling Fear is not going to wipe up the Adeline. And there's 2 Adelines here. One might get killed by a Thirst, but the second one's just going to be a problem just because it lines up so well against the board wipe that Beky happens to have at the time.
Nighthawk Scavenger. This one, we saw Beky bring this one in from the sideboard. 3/3 flying Death Touch lifelink. So that is going to be able to trade with Adeline. Of course, we know that there is a second Adeline available.
Yeah, and something really neat here is for the Dimir control deck is at this point, Adeline's almost actively a liability just because Adeline has this triggered ability whenever she attacks to make a 1/1 attacking, and that's a lifelink creature that Beky has, so it's just going to be getting Beky free life every time Sky attacks, unless Skybilz chooses to attack with Adeline and trade. So that faster trade, even in the spot where might not normally have been ideal for Skybilz.
Oh my goodness. Beky cracked the clue given by Fateful Absence, found a second Crippling Fear, a cheaper Crippling Fear, but did not find the 6th land it needed to get it through the Redain tax. Fires off a couple of Bloodchief's Thirst, and wow, Thalia Guardian of Thraben as well to add even more of a cost to these Crippling Fears.
Yeah, and this is something the white decks have been doing for a little bit in Standard, which is just applying a ton of taxing effects to your board wipe, making the 4-mana board wipes not quite as resilient against them as you would like. It's the reason blue-red decks favor things like Syndiclasm, which clear up creatures for cheap, even if they don't get Redain, just because it's very, very hard to actually get to the mana to resolve board wipes against mono white in the mid game.
So Beky having fought valiantly in this game and number 2 to hold off the horde of white creatures. Kind of a little bit stymied here by the inability to find the 6th land. Divide by 0 looking really unfortunate against all of these creatures. She's not dead yet.
No, though that Adeline that we keep talking about is surviving the Crippling Fear is going to continue to be a problem. The Divide by 0 is going to have to be spent on the Redain or something else to be able to actually resolve a Crippling Fear in the first place, and then there's going to be that Adeline left over afterwards. There's probably even going to be a Faceless Haven left over afterwards, and we're approaching the point where the Haven alone might be lethal.
Not quite enough mana for Skybilz to both activate Faceless Haven, attack with a Faceless Haven, and play Adeline free combat. So it's just going to favor getting the 4/4 down.
Yeah, and this is a really rough spot for Beky, because if she bounces the Adelaine, then the Crippling Fear is not coming down. But if she bounces, even if she bounces the Redain just comes down post-combat. And if she bounces the Redain post-combat, then she's taken 6 damage and is dead to the Faceless Haven next turn.
Does take 5 damage. Oh, there is the 6th land, but unfortunately, because of that double tax from Redain and Thalia, it's not going to be enough. Beky can play a blocker in the form of the Geist and the Sciences, but not going to do it. And Skybilz with mono white aggro is going to take this one down 2-0. So a great performance there from Skybilz. And, you know, we saw some people in the chat, Arya, discussing that Skybilz, you know, we said she started in season 1 and 2, but she has played from 1 and 2 and made multiple playoffs across the history of the VML.
Yeah, and even given the group we're in, I wouldn't be surprised if this season's no different. I mean, Mono White's a really strong deck, and Skybilz has shown that she has a good amount of experience and has been piloting the deck really, really well. And the deck's pretty resilient, so I suspect it'll stick around for a little bit. It's no matter what you do, there's not really an easy way to beat a bunch of taxing effects on your answers, because even with an answer suite that's lined up to the deck, you're still going to have to deal with the fact that you're often going to be trading down on mana, and that's what makes Mono White such a resilient deck.
All right. Well, so, I mean, that's news to my ears. I mean, you know, good news, because I've been also playing Mono White for the last couple of weeks, having spent literally multiple years going on about how Thalia is my least favorite card of all time. I just immediately started playing Thalia when she was printed. And yeah, I have to agree with you. I think the deck is flexible. It deals well with the creature matchup. It deals well with control, and there's a lot of play to it, especially with Brutal Cathar and flipping day and night and all sorts of stuff. So I've been enjoying it as well, and certainly this deck has a long way to go yet. Okay, so that's it. That was our first feature match of the evening. Let's have a look at our second one. We are going to division number 6, and we have Olivia, Dunlap, and I believe both of our players in the division 6 feature match are currently at 3-0. So these they're fighting to stay undefeated in division 6 and get off to a great start in their VML season. Mardu Vampires, this one has been floating around a little bit here and there before Crimson Vow, but is it now finally going to become a playable archetype in the
Quite possibly. We spoke a little bit about the various aggressive decks that were trying to prey on more controlling decks, like the blue-red control decks, the blue-black control decks, and Vampires is the perfect aggressive deck to prey on other aggressive decks. Not only do the threats line up pretty well and let you apply a good amount of pressure early, the fact that the deck has access to Vampires Vengeance, which is a board wipe that hits only non-vampires, so it's going to be clearing the mono white decks like Mono White's board a lot of the time without affecting your own board at all. Leaves a deck really well positioned to do well in a meta where aggressive decks are a large part.
I've seen quite a few different builds of these vampire lists floating around as well. I played against one earlier that was trying to essentially break dominating vampire with various sacrifice outlets, which I found very interesting. Immiston Predator, surprisingly, still a vampire, even though I forget every time. And every time I look back, yep, that's a vampire dragon. So lots of fun synergies happening in the vampires archetype right now. Let's have a look at who Olivia is playing against. Oh my goodness. Can I just say that these eye twitch bat animations have been incredible. I don't know who do we have to thank for this? Is it Phoebe? Because they are amazing and I love them. And eye twitch is one, in my opinion, eye twitch is one of the cutest creatures in Magic. So I'm really excited to see. All right, it's Rebecca Black. Rebecca has played in quite a few seasons of the VML, 3-0 currently with this week with Izzet Control. So this is another Hullbreaker Horror deck, Arya, but this one kind of on the shell of the old Arryn's Epiphany list.
Yeah, this is more conventional in terms of decks that have existed before, and what blue-red really brings to these Hullbreaker Horror shells is the ability to ramp into it with something like Unexpected Windfall. Whereas for blue-black, Horror is going to be a liability against aggressive decks. It's going to be something that's too slow. It's a 7-drop you're going to take out. In a deck like this, Horror is actually fantastic against aggressive decks because some games you can just cast Windfall, try and ramp into the Horror, and have it take over the game all by itself as early as turn 5. And so that's definitely something scary for an aggressive deck like Olivia's in a matchup like this.
Okay, well, let's go down to the feature match area and find out whether we are going to finally see some Hullbreaker action here in the VML. We are looking from Olivia's side and on a mull to 6 right now, although this hand is not looking so hot either.
No, it's really not great. The deck has, I believe, 6 1-drops, and you really want to have a 1-drop to apply pressure in this matchup. At the very least, the ideal situation would have multiple creatures so that you could curve a 2 into a 3 if you don't have a 1-drop. But given that it's a 6, it has just the 1 threat, which is a little awkward. And Light Up the Night, damage to face is not quite what you're looking for in this matchup. You really want resilient threats that'll keep doing damage over and over.
Lands off the top, certainly not what Olivia's looking for either, but does get the Vampire Socialite down. And this one, 2-2 with Menace, and later on can also put counters on your other vampires if your opponent's lost life.
Yeah, definitely the sort of threat you want to get down early against a deck like Izzet. Start building up some incremental value, making all your other vampires larger threats. But given that there are no other vampires to be seen, not the most impressive threat on its own.
Just having a look at what Rebecca's working with. Currently looking a little bit mono red. Oh, there's a Cathartic Pyre, so that's going to take out the only threat that Olivia has, and Rebecca's going to breathe a sigh of relief to see the turn pass back just with the 3 mana up.
Yeah, I think at this point, as the Izzet Epiphany deck, you've got to feel, as the Izzet control deck, you've got to feel pretty far ahead. The fact that in the mid game, your answers are going to line up pretty well with the threats from vampires. All these direct damage to face spells, not all that useful when you're at 20, and you're going to be able to take over the game eventually with something like Hullbreaker Horror. So this is a pretty good spot for Rebecca.
Just having a look to see how many copies of things Rebecca's playing. So Rebecca's playing 2 Smoldering Egg, 2 Leah, and 3 Hullbreaker Horror in terms of threats. And Arryn's Epiphany abandoned altogether.
Yeah, that's a general trend with the Izzet decks these days, with the fact that Hullbreaker Horror kind of makes Arryn's Epiphany unnecessary. Previously, the deck needed a way to ensure they could actually close out in the late game after getting ahead on cards, or use all the extra mana it generated to just end the game, even if behind on board. But Hullbreaker Horror kind of does both those things. It's 7 power, so it closes out the game well, and it also just completely takes over a board on its own by just letting you cast a bunch of spells and bounce all your opponent's creatures.
So we're going to see Rebecca spin some wheels. And get some card selection going. Plenty of time since Olivia clearly struggling, flooded out. And, you've got to feel for Olivia. Having gone down to 6, I can definitely understand the reluctance to mulligan any further. But sometimes, sometimes it just doesn't work out.
Yeah, and this is one of the strengths you get or one of the weaknesses you get playing an aggressive deck like Vampires that's slanted to be able to beat other aggressive decks, is that in matchups like Control, particularly on the Mulligan, you're going to have a lot of dead cards like Light Up the Night, Play with Fire, and that's going to leave you pretty poorly positioned when mulliganing sometimes because you may just draw a bunch of dead cards, and that only exacerbates the problems you have from mulliganing to fewer cards than 7.
Season cards going into the Foretell Zone. There are a couple of copies of Saw It Coming, one copy of Demon Bolt available to Rebecca.
Yeah, and while we spoke about how bad these removal spells are as top decks in terms of being mostly dead cards, Play with Fire might be the one exception to that. Being an instant speed spell, it allows Olivia to play with fire and to get damage to Rebecca, and then activate the Falconrod Pit Fighter even without having dealt combat damage.
And that is exactly what is going to happen here. So in response to the Prismari command, we're going to see that Pit Fighter be sacrificed to itself to discard 1, draw 2. This is looking a little bit better. Blood-Tithe Harvester and Immerstone Predator, those are both pretty reasonable threats here, but is it too little too late for Olivia?
There's a pretty high chance it might be, just because we know both the cards foretold in Rebecca's deck must be answers, because there's only Sword Comings and Demon Bolts to be foretold, no Epiphanies, so they can trade 1-for-1 with something like a Predator or a Blood-Tithe Harvester. And at this point, a lot of Rebecca's deck are just things that Olivia's not going to have any answers to. Things like Hullbreaker Horror or even a Lear will probably just take over the game on their own, and there's not really much to be done about it.
There is one of those Foretell cards. Saw It Coming. So there's no to Nighthawk Scavenger. And we expect that the other one is, it's either the other copy of Saw It Coming or it's Demon Bolt, which is quite interesting because Demon Bolt, not an answer to Immerstone Predator when there's already a creature down on the battlefield.
No, though in conjunction with another removal spell, it may end up being enough. And at this point, Rebecca's got 4 cards in hand, didn't make a land drop this turn, I believe, so we know it's 4 spells.
Oh, and here we go. There is one of those 4 spells. Hullbreaker Horror down on the battlefield. Monsieur the Pinchy is in the house, and he's going to come in and say, surprise, you are very small and I am going to eat you.
Yeah, and Olivia's digging for an answer, but there's really not much to be found. Knowing that the foretold card is either a Demon Bolt or a Sword Coming, one way or the other, it's going to give Rebecca a chance to answer this Light Up the Night to make sure her Hullbreaker Horror doesn't die if she doesn't want it to.
So there's Light Up the Night, targeting Hullbreaker Horror. X equals 4, but of course you get X plus 1 since it's targeting a creature.
Yeah, if the foretold spell is a Sword Coming, then of course it could counter the Light Up the Night. But even with the Demon Bolt, there's a few different options Rebecca would have. She'd have the ability to return her own Hullbreaker Horror to hand. She'd also have the ability to return the Light Up the Night to hand. So really an abundance of ways to save our horror in this spot.
All right, the horror is in fact saved by a copy of Fading Hope. It's going to send it back to hand. This card is just so annoying to deal with once it's, once the mana is available for these Izzet decks to deploy this horror. It's just, they always have a way of getting it back.
Yeah, the Izzet deck basically never plays the Hullbreaker Horror without having a 1-mana spell or more than that up, and just any spell at all means at the very least you can bounce your own horror to your hand and have it dying, and sometimes you can do more than that, bouncing the removal spells, gaining tempo, and being able to actually start getting ahead on board.
Just this game has just looked pretty doomed for Olivia from the start, unfortunately. Thanks to that bit of early game flood that we saw. And looking at this vampires list, Arya, I'm not sure that there's a lot that kind of snowballs in the late game for this strategy.
Yeah, part of what makes horror so strong is that it invalidates basically any other late game. It doesn't even really matter what Olivia has in her deck at this point. She could have Alrund's Epiphany in her red-black deck, and even that wouldn't matter because whatever the threat is, horror can just bounce it. And this Izzet deck is very good at ensuring it can keep casting spells. So one way or the other, Olivia's probably not going to be left with much to do.
Yeah, I'm looking at some of these cards. Edgar, that is a pretty great card, but doesn't really matter if it gets returned to hand all the time. Blood Vial Purveyor again. There's just not a lot of protection for these creatures against the horror, and it's just so unlikely that the Izzet deck runs out of spells to trigger either of the abilities.
Yeah, so, particularly with threats out of an aggressive deck, one of the problems you're going to run into is that all your expensive threats are prone to being bounced, and you can't replay them multiple times in the same turn. And all your cheap threats kind of pale in comparison to just a 7/8.
That's going to do it. Olivia scoops it up, and we are going to have a look at the sideboarding now. See, 3 copies of Duress and 2 copies of Go Blank. Imagine that we're going to see some number of those come in. Inscription of Ruin maybe as well.
Yeah.
What? But are these cards really going to help a lot?
I think so. Making sure that the Izzet deck has to stumble a little, maybe can't get to its horror as easily, is nice. And then on top of that, maybe some more effective answers to the horror than things like Play with Fire would be good. I talked about a little bit about how you have this problem where your cheap things don't match up to the horror, and your expensive cards are easily bounced. But removal is the one exception to that, because your cheap removal spell, it still kills the horror, and if they bounce it to your hand, by that point in the game, you often have the mana to play it 2-3 times. So it's often going to be enough to get rid of the horror, even if there's a bunch of spells to go with it.
So in a world where a card like Hullbreaker Horror is, potentially taking over the metagame, do you think we're going to see people turn to the more inefficient discard spells like check for traps, maybe even that the 0/4 that kind of does a Vendilion click? Cards like that.
Possibly. Spells that things like the 0/4 do have the advantage of not having a high cost, which makes them good against horror. Something that might be we've also got another card in that vein from Crimson Vow with Dread Fugue. So there's a lot of cheap discard spells, and those do line up pretty well against horror just because you can't really bounce a 1-mana spell. And they're also very good at clearing the way for horror when you have your own horror that you want to play.
So we saw Olivia play around the Spikefield Hazard that she knew about by not deploying this Valentin until, it was out of the way. But Rebecca did, in fact, find a second Spikefield Hazard. So Valentin goes to the Exile Zone. Vampire Socialite, the draw for Olivia. And I wonder if we'll see her actually hold on to this Agadeem's Awakening, or whether we'll see it, played as a land. Would you have any consideration to just holding it?
I don't think so. At this point, you're 2 mana away from being able to cast it for any value at all. And so many of the threats in this deck cost 4 or more mana that just holding it and hoping to get by probably won't work. Yeah. Additionally, like the ability to double spell against the bounce spell off in Rebecca's hand may end up being a consideration for the late game. So getting lands out is good for that as well.
No white mana for Edgar, unfortunately. This match has just been, I really feel for Olivia, because we've all been there. We've all been in a thing where you had to mulligan, and then your draw is just a bit awkward. Your opponent feels like they have all these cards, they're answering everything, you can't get any damage in. There is some white mana though, so maybe, a little bit of hope here for Olivia, although it does not you chooses to use Edgar to get an extra point of damage in instead of going for the counter.
Yeah, I think in this spot, 4/4 Edgar versus a 5/5 Edgar isn't a huge difference. It's going to be 2 turns before the extra counter adds up to more damage. And getting more damage in early is definitely one of the ways you really want to pressure the blue-red deck in a spot like this. You really want to make sure that by the time they're getting horrors down, you're threatening lethal the turn they play horror, and then you can do things like remove it while they don't have interaction up.
We're finally going to see Olivia make some substantial attacks in. So, oh my goodness, double fading hope. They just always have it, Arya.
Yeah, though as the vampires deck in this spot, double fading hope isn't actually too bad. Yes, it prevents Rebecca from taking damage this turn, but at this point, Rebecca's completely won out that card advantage she had from early in the game, and now you're just trading 1 for 1. You have a Vanishing Verse for an eventual Hullbreaker Horror. There's not as much card advantage in these decks now that the whole iteration Epiphany package is gone, so you have a decent shot at playing a 1 for 1 game at a time in the game like this.
You see Rebecca hovering over Hall of the Storm Giants. That when is it giant beatdown time?
I hate to be the bearer of bad news, but the answer is probably almost never.
What?
With Alrund's Epiphany, the deck had the ability.
Take that back.
Yeah, with Arryn's Epiphany, the deck had the ability to sneak in for a few points of damage and then do with a hull once and then do a whole bunch of damage in an Epiphany turn or two. With Epiphany gone, that's going to be the case a lot less of the time. And once you get a Hullbreaker Horror in play, 7 damage doesn't matter. They could easily be at 50 and you'd probably win.
So here's Vanishing Verse on that Hall of the Storm Giants. It is blue, because when it becomes the giant, obviously it does take on the blue color identity. So Vanishing Burst does work. That's a nice kind of waste 6 mana Stone Rain you from Olivia.
Yeah, it's not too bad for Rebecca either, though. At this point, she needs to prevent Olivia from deploying too many threats and getting too far ahead on board before something like a horror comes down. It's trading with the 1 removal spell in Olivia's hand, clearing the way for future horror, and it is trading for her entire turn at a point in the game where she is kind of getting these threats in hand that won't be too relevant in a few turns, so she needs to deploy them as quickly as possible.
Oh, look at this. The secret second mode on Cathartic Fire. You do not see that happen very often. Discard 2, draw 2 for the Cathartic Fire. And we see Olivia find a copy of Voldaren Estates, which, let me tell you, Arya, the sum total of my experience with Voldaren Estates was putting this in my sealed pool at pre-release and regretting it intensely.
I can't admit to even knowing what the card does.
Okay, it's a colorless land. It taps for colorless. It taps for any color to cast a vampire. And then you can pay 5 and tap to make a blood token, but that cost is reduced by the number of vampires you have.
Well, blood tokens on no. I'd imagine Olivia's going to have a pretty hard time beating a Resolve Lair if she doesn't find removal this turn.
She doesn't find removal, but she does find a copy of Sorin the Mirthless, which is gonna go Dark Confidanting. There is an Instant Predator.
Yeah. One of the problems here, though, is that as long as it's not an answer, that Leah has given Rebecca access to approximately 15 cards at this point, I'd imagine, and it doesn't really matter what threat you have because it's just so much removal that can get through pretty much anything, and the Lear itself is slowly.
That is like the most Arya thing I've ever heard. Usually, when you're in the booth and someone says approximately, they're gonna say something dumb. They're gonna say like 15 million, right? But with Arya, you get the full expert experience. Just that's actually the actual number. I don't know if that's the actual number. It probably doesn't matter, but it is in my mind, a million squillion cards out of the graveyard for Leah. Get that Pit Fighter out of here. Start taking chunks out of Soren's loyalty. And things not looking great for Olivia in game number 2 either.
Yeah, it's a little awkward, definitely, with aggressive decks like this. We spoke about it being slanted to beat other creature decks, and it's really shown against a deck like Blue Red, where that slight loss in consistency and speed really hurt against a deck like Izzet, where the late game is just so far over the top of what anything the Vampire deck is doing is.
So Divide by Zero takes care of Instant Predator, at least for now. Of course, Leah does say spells can't be countered on it, so you cannot cast your Sword Comings out of the graveyard, unfortunately.
Yeah, though there is a way to do that as well. The trick is to cast a Sword Coming, and then in response to it, flashback a Fading Hope to bounce your own Leah. So if push comes to shove,
that's just
counter
gross.
spells can be cast.
That's incredible and gross, and I love it. Okay, I'm submitting Leah next week. You've convinced me. Next week's opponent, if you can hear me, that was a joke. Or was it? We are hearing though. I mean, Olivia, this Mardu Vampires deck, it does seem super sweet, and we are learning that this is actually Olivia's first season in the VML, coming over from the speedrunning community, which is super awesome. And starting out 3-0 in your first season, that's quite an achievement.
Yeah, it's not something to be scoffed at. I mean, I certainly haven't done it myself. And even with the loss here, I'd say Olivia's still really well positioned to make it to the playoffs. With 2 more wins, she'd be practically guaranteed to. So even just going 2-1 over the coming weeks, and even with a 1-2, there's a chance she'd be able to make top 24 in one of the wildcard slots. Yeah,
absolutely. So we go back over to Rebecca's turn, and it is there is a mascot exhibition. Oh, there is also a Goldspan Dragon. Usually when this starts happening, people start rolling up their playmat, putting their dice away, etc. Environmental Sciences gets the 7th land finally for Rebecca.
Yeah, and it's got to be just terrifying in Olivia's seat, knowing that all 4 of those cards, well, one of them is a mascot exhibition, but the other 3 are all relevant spells because Rebecca would have played them out turns ago if they were lands.
So Instant Predator is going to do a good job, at least for now, of preventing a profitable attack with this Goldspan Dragon.
Yeah, that's definitely one of the Predator's strong points. Just the fact that it lines up so well against Dragon and prevents the Dragon from being able to effectively attack and make treasure very often. That said, with a Leah to go with it, it's going to be a lot less effective.
Yeah, we can't quite tell exactly what spells are in the graveyard, but just imagine some spells that are in this deck, and they're probably there. Spikefield Hazard, sure. That's one of them.
Yep, and more than anything, more than even getting rid of the Pit Fighter, more than tapping on, more than anything else, really, this is more than getting in damage. This is really just letting Rebecca attack and make 2 more mana. And with all those spells in Rebecca's graveyard, really the only thing she's stuck on is mana. As long as she's getting mana from that Goldspan, there's not much in Olivia's deck that's going to be able to keep up with the Leah.
I think Olivia doesn't know about the can't be countered clause on Leah, because she did just choose to exile Sword coming from the graveyard with that Instant Predator trigger. So maybe a little bit of a... no, I mean, Leah has a lot of text on it, so pretty easy to miss. And not necessarily an intuitive ability that you would expect.
It may also be a precaution against that Leah plus Fading Hope line. You never know.
Okay, that is true. Yeah, that is true. Here's Edgar. Edgar pumping up Innocent Predator. It's just so dumb. It's so stupid to me.
It doesn't feel like a reasonable
It doesn't
thing.
make any
be
sense.
happening.
But Edgar and Innocent Predator is a super cool combo because you can sack the 1/1s, you know, made by the coffin side to the Predator, and then of course the front side is does provide that load ability.
Yeah, it's a little awkward here for Olivia being forced to attack with the Predator. In an ideal world, she'd be able to keep it back, what with being at 5 life and it being able to prevent the Goldspan Dragon making mana, but she kind of has to start eating away at Rebecca's graveyard, because otherwise Rebecca is just going to take over the game in a couple of turns with the air.
Nighthawk Scavenger comes down. That is a big flying threat, and it's time again! It's Pinchy Part 2, Hullbreaker Horror coming in. Well, really coming out of the ocean. Oh, there it is. Okay. Spikefield has it to your face. Bounce the 6/4. I have a flying dragon. That is going to do it, and it is Rebecca Black with a dominating performance with Izzet control, taking this one out over Mardu Vampires. Goldspan Dragon swinging in for the last hit, and you know, a valiant effort by Olivia, certainly very well played, but unfortunately can't quite stand up to the raw card advantage of this Izzet control deck.
Yeah, and that and variants of that matchup are something I'd expect to see play out a lot over the next few weeks as we go through these cycles of these aggressive decks being the only things that can beat these Izzet Epiphany decks, and these mid-range decks popping up, even with bad Izzet Epiphany matchups, to prey on those aggressive decks, and then Izzet Epiphany taking its spot again and center stage, just because it's very hard to beat for these slightly less consistent aggro mid-range decks.
All right, wow. So that is the those are our first two feature matches. Arya and I are gonna go away for a very quick break. We are gonna watch some awesome Lady of the Crease interview videos, which I'm super excited about because she is really good at them and they're awesome. And then we'll be back after the break with some very, very cool featured matches from some very cool people right after these videos. See you soon.
Hello everyone, and welcome back to Interview with the Vampire. My name is Nicole Callahan, also known as Lady of the Crease. I am your Mistress of Midnight tonight, joined here by the wonderful MythicMikaela. Mikaela, how are you doing?
Hello, I'm doing well. I'm kind of wishing I'd gone and put on like some vampire clothes or something, but
you're
it's
incognito
okay.
Right now. You don't want to give it away, you know.
Yeah. I'm loungewear vampire right now.
There are werewolves abound, so we don't want to, like just not looking like you just came from a vampire wedding or nothing, right?
I think I just came from a D&D game. That's
pretty sweet. Keeping it on magic related. So So speaking of magic related, Crimson Vow is out and about, running wild in Standard. What has your favorite Crimson Vow card been so far?
Okay, everyone can laugh at me, but I have been drafting a lot, and Reckless Impulse is like my favorite card in the set because I like drawing cards, and that's basically drawing cards.
Isn't that just like the mini showdown of the Scalds, right?
It's exile the top 2 cards of your library until the end of your next turn. You may play those cards.
I love that card. That is a great card. I actually have 2 of them in my latest Black-Red Vampire draft deck. So.
Oh, nice. Nice. Yeah, it's a great card. Love it.
Well, keep it with the vampire theme. I like that. It works well with the vampire decks. It does. I love it. I love it. Now, what about your favorite card in Standard in general right now?
My goodness. So that one's hard because, like, I feel like there's a lot of cards I hate right now, right?
So give us that. You know what? Let's run with it. What card do you hate in Standard right now?
Well, I was helping Jana test this week, and I do not want to see the card Hullbreaker again.
Monsieur Pinchy, right?
Yeah. Nah, I'm over it. It's like my style card, but yeah. If I don't want to play a mirror match with the card, I'm just completely over it.
Oh, it's a mirror match too? Le Pinchy mirror match. I like it.
Yes, that's awful. It's awful.
That sounds wonderfully terrible, and I love it. I love it. So back to the party. Now, are you team Olivia or are you team Soren?
I don't know. I kind of feel like I have some more team Soren, like the whole like brooding in the corner. Like, I just really feel that.
Kind of like with your glass of wine, just kind of like slowly circling. Just take a sip. And, well, I guess it's not wine, but whatever, you know.
It's wine, okay?
Well, it's wine. It's red wine, as far as I'm concerned, right? That's what it's gotta be. So, as a mainstay here at the VML, and like an absolute just perennial in every playoff that we have, what does the VML mean to you? What is the biggest takeaway you've had from the VML so far? I want to hear from like a season 1 veteran. What does the VML mean to you?
You know, it's a really great community, and it makes me really motivated and excited to play Magic each week. You know, I get to look forward to testing. I get to look forward to chatting about decks with other people, and it's really cool to have that community and that excitement behind Magic, even when you can't be together in person.
I love that. I love that. It gets you excited even when you're helping your friend test a Hullbreaker horror mirror. I if that's not love, then what is? Well, Mikaela, thank you so much for joining us tonight, and I appreciate your time, and best of luck to you the rest of this season. Keep it rolling, all right?
Thanks. Bye.
See you in the playoffs?
I hope.
Let's hope. Bye. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Who, What, Werewolf. I am your hostess of Howls, Nicole Callahan, also known as Lady of the Crease, joined tonight in this eternal night by the lovely Julie. Julie, how are you doing tonight?
Oh, I'm wonderful. Thanks for asking.
You are wonderful. You are so welcome. And now that we're all wonderful, right here, smack dab in the middle of Crimson Vow Standard, what has your favorite Crimson Vow card been so far?
My favorite Crimson Vow card so far has got to be the Shipbreaker Horror. I like casting a lot of spells, so something that rewards me for casting a lot of spells is great. And it's just a big, splashy, pinchy horror, and it's great.
I like the Pinchy, Monsieur le Pinchy, as we like to call him here at the VML. That is great. I love it. Now, Crimson Vow, everybody's talking about the vampires, vampire weddings, vampire. But on like Team Werewolf, on the flip side here, we're sending in some crashers for this wedding. There was Arlen, Teferi, Kaya, Chandra, and Adeline. Do you have a favorite from these wedding crashers?
Well, I do have this poster of Kaya behind me. I'm a big fan of the whole cast of Wedding Crashers, honestly. My favorite is probably Chandra, that dress being the tiebreaker.
Right. I think we all want that dress. In any color. Every color.
Every color.
I love it. I love it. So now as a werewolf, can you tell me your favorite vampire card? In Magic's history, it doesn't have to be from Crimson Vow. It doesn't have to be,
Magic's history?
Yeah, sure. Give me any vampire that stands out to you that you like.
Oh, what was that one? Oh, I can't remember the name.
We should do a Guess That Vampire. Describe it.
It's from Battle for Zendikar. It's 1 black for a 2/3 flying first strike.
That wasn't Nighthawk Scavenger, right? Or something
no.
like that? No, not Nighthawk.
Not that one. It's one of the Blood Chiefs. It's the legendary one. And it like puts counters on all of your things.
I know what you're talking about. Me and the vampires aren't on a first name basis though. So
my answer would be easier if you asked me for a werewolf, obviously.
Ooh, so tell me your werewolf, since we are Team Werewolf here.
Well, obviously it's Arlen. It's gotta be.
How could it not be? The Pack's Hope. Everybody loves Arlen.
The new Arlen card too is a lot of fun.
Oh yes, gotta love those flippy werewolves. There's so much more. They're so deep. Vampires are just whatever. No name it. It flies. Whatever. Werewolves are cool. Werewolves
There's
need
a
two
lot
sides
going
to a
on.
card. A lot going
Yeah.
on. We got layers. Now, speaking of a lot going on, we've had a lot going on here at the VML. This is our 6th season, and you've been a part of the VML in the past. What is your favorite part of the VML? What means the most to you about being part of this community?
The biggest thing for me for the VML is just getting to know the community. Like, I've met so many great people and made so many cool connections, and just like even just interacting with my opponents before we play is so much fun. Like, everybody involved is so great.
Oh, that's so sweet. And we are lucky to have you as a part of the community. Now, before we close out here, we're werewolves. I need to hear your best werewolf howl.
Of course, of course. Oh.
I love it. I love it. It's so subtle yet so clear.
It's the point across.
Julie, thank you so much for your time, and best of luck to you the rest of the season.
Thanks for having me. You too.
Welcome back to coverage of VML Season 6. I'm Haiyue, I'm here with Arya, and we are bringing you Week 4 feature matches here at the VML. And if I seem distracted, it's because there is a purring bundle of cat in my lap who is very shy and is just going to sit here slightly below everyone's vision. So, lol. So adorable. So adorable. So the VML is of course brought to you in partnership with NRG Series and sponsored by Wizards of the Coast. And Arya, tell me, what have we learned so far this evening?
Well, we learned that Hullbreaker Horror is a pretty good magic card.
Really? Monsieur Pinchy?
Yeah.
He's a good boy?
It would certainly appear that way. I don't know if I'd go so far as to call Hullbreaker Horror a good boy, but
okay, what
an
about
Eldritch
a good
abomination of greater than average quality.
You take that back. I don't think there's anything eldritch about a giant lobster with a plethora of claws.
It has horror in the name.
Not just because something has horror in the name, it doesn't mean that it's necessarily horrible.
But
Anyway.
it kind of implies it.
Okay, well, I'll agree with that. It's starting out with a disadvantage in life. That's all we can say. All right, let's have a go. Let's see who's on our feature match next, because I believe it's going to be a pretty cool one. So on the one side, from Division 4, Samantha Murphy, who we were actually having a pretty great time in Vegas with on Mono White Aggro again. Is there anything about this particular Mono White Aggro that strikes you as different?
It seems fairly stock for the most part. I will note the Legion Angel, which used to be a staple of Mono White and now is sometimes included, sometimes not included. It's not at its best against more controlling decks. It's a little slow, but in aggressive and mid-range matchups, it's a bit of a spoiler, this is one of those. It really has the potential to just take over the game by providing a stream of 4/3 flyers.
I have to say I am partial to the Legion Angel just because of it's just card advantage. It's just straight up card advantage in Mono White, and it's really nice, especially as you say in these kind of matchups. All right, let's have a look at the other side, and this is a Spicer. It is the MythicMikaela, co-chair of the VML, Musa. General awesome human being, Vancouverite Canadian on Mono Red Aggro. Now, ever since the some might say timely. Some might say it stuck around too long, demise of Embercleave. We have not seen mono red aggro on very many menus, but is this the comeback? Is it time for red decks to start winning again?
It might be. Chandra Dress to Kill is really, really powerful. It's a 3-mana planeswalker that's a source of card advantage, which is not that common. It gives a deck like Mono Red a lot of staying power into the late game against a deck like Izzet, where previously the lackluster threats and the inability to push through a bunch of damage with something like Embercleave or Torbrad meant they didn't quite have the staying power against more controlling decks, but something like Chandra might save that.
Something like I am personally extremely excited to see in this deck list. Alchemist Gambit. Who needs blue to take an extra turn? Let's just straight up one red. Let's go.
That's certainly the case, though I would like to point out that the MythicMikaela with this list can actually cast an Alchemist Gambit for the cleave cost as a result of those River Glide pathways in the deck, presumably in there for just that reason.
Oh my goodness. You get four blue sources for the double blue in that cleave cost of Alchemist Gambit. I love it. Gambit is the correct word, I think, for the choice to bring this deck. Let's see if it pays off for the MythicMikaela. I am super excited to see a little bit of red deck wins ? In action. Okay. Usher of the Fallen, Brutal Cathar, and Elite Spellbinder for Samantha on the draw up against Falcraft, Pitfighter, Hall Monitor, and Dragonspire. So both players off to, have some pretty nice hands going.
Yeah, the Pitfighter in the MythicMikaela's hand is going to be really, really strong here. One of the ways that Mono Red can sometimes have an advantage in a matchup like this is just having a pile of really efficient removal, like that Dragon's Fire. It says a bunch of Play with Fires and other burn spells, and that having an early threat to follow up with that can be really powerful.
All right, so Falcraft Pitfighter comes in. And we might see some racing in this particular matchup since, both players on that aggressive plan will take Visionary in hand for Caroline. And this card has been very impressive in the limited format of Crimson Vow. Is it as impressive in Constructed?
Maybe not quite as impressive, but it's certainly nothing to be dismissed out of hand, particularly in an aggressive matchup like this where there's going to be a lot of one-for-one trading, with all the burn spells on the mono-red side, often trading for the cheap threats out of mono-white. Getting a card like Visionary that just gets you a 2-for-1 is really strong.
Reckless Stormseeker ready to join the party for Caroline, but it's going to be Hall Monitor to start off with. And says, "You get back to class. You don't belong into this corridor." And the 1/1 soldier unable to block this turn, although I expect we're going to see Brutal Cathar. Oh yeah, and Samantha respecting that card advantage takes out the Voltaic Visionary.
Yeah, and we're seeing Caroline opt to be very, very aggressive over the course of these early few turns, opting not to trade for the Usher, opting to not remove the Usher of the follow, opting to just deploy threats and get in damage rather than try and build up a good board presence. And that's a result of one of the ways that Mono Red has something of an advantage in this matchup, which is just that if the Mono White deck falls to 3, 4, 5 life, the Mono Red deck can often just finish the game with burn spells, whereas Mono White doesn't really have any reach, so it needs to deal every final point of damage to actually close out the game.
Reckless Stormseeker, having been up until now mostly paired with Essica's Chariot in the Magda Gruul based decks. Is it, what does it do in this kind of super low curve deck?
Well, mostly it's just a 3-mana 3/3 haste that gives all your future threats haste. It's really not something you're looking to flip reliably all that early, or look to like power out some really strong synergy-based plays like with Essica's Chariot. It's just a cheap threat that continues to give other things haste, and sometimes it flips tonight. You get to give things trample, and that can be really scary, particularly against the control decks.
That's actually a pretty good point, especially with this mono white deck pumping out these 1/1s thanks to Usher of the Fallen. This is honestly, I've played a lot of this mono white deck, Arya, and I've rarely seen an Usher of the Fallen make 2 1/1s. I'm pretty impressed with that.
I am as well. I can't say it's something that happens too often. And it's really strong against mono red particularly. Normally those tokens might not matter that much. They might just, be 1/1s not affecting the board, get wiped up by a Syndiclasm or something like that. But in this matchup, they're really, really button because they're going to be trading for things like Pit Fighters and actually getting Samantha real cards.
Dragon's Fire takes out Brutal Cathar, and Caroline's going to get that Voltaic Visionary right back. Draw a card. Shock yourself. Find a Den of the Bugbear that in that beautiful D&D manual art. You gotta, there's one thing that Caroline likes. As somebody that knows Caroline relatively well. Gotta pimp out the lands. Gotta pimp out the styles. We're gonna see the entire board traded off here.
Yeah, and again, we talked about that Usher getting all those triggers early. Well, it was really, really impactful here because those tokens that traded for the Stormseeker, Samantha didn't have to spend a card on them. They came for free, and it's allowed her to largely keep up when she otherwise might be falling behind to everything Caroline is doing.
So here we go. Attacking with the team. Den of the Bugbear is coming in as well. Oh, and more 3-drops for Samantha. Spellbinder, of course, doesn't get anything because of the Caroline being empty-handed.
Yeah, though this Adeline here is really, really powerful just because of how it lines up against a lot of the removal out of Mono Red. Mono Red relying on Dragon's Fires, Play with Fires, doesn't have a lot of things that do 4 damage, and that makes Adeline really strong.
So Samantha has Cave of the Frost Dragon. Caroline has 3 Dens of the Bugbear. So we might see some of these creature lands trading off with each other, or I guess Cave of the Frost Dragon being a 3/4 is actually representing quite a nice block on the entire board.
Yeah, though that Reckless Stormseeker flipping in a spot like this is really, really scary. It allows any of Caroline's threats to attack into, well, any save for the Goblin to attack into the Adeline. And that leaves Samantha in not great shape.
In comes the Storm Charged Seeker. There is a double block available.
Yeah, though the Hall Monitor will likely prevent the Adeline from being able to block, so I doubt that the Storm Charged Seeker will end up getting double blocked.
You see Caroline hovering over the Hall Monitor. Okay, it's going to stop the Cave of the Frost Dragon, so if you want to prevent any of this damage, you have to throw your Adeline under the bus. That's not going to happen. Hopefully Initiate, not really very impactful at this stage of the game without the ability to get a bunch of counters on it. And looks like it's time, Samantha says, to just push damage of her own.
Yeah,
this one that comes in attacking is quite annoying.
Yeah, though in this spot particularly, Caroline could possibly just ignore it completely. She's very likely to have lethal in with the Den of the Bugbears in conjunction with the Hall Monitor if she finds a land, and if she doesn't find a land and she finds some spell that's also likely to give her lethal. So one way or another, it's a pretty good spot for her. And even if she takes it slow, as long as she doesn't leave herself dead next turn, she should be fine. because the Stormcharge Seeker is just going to keep getting in for damage.
His will take Visionary. That one is a little bit awkward because she cannot play the Voltaic Visionary and fire up the den. But Visionary does represent 5 trample damage.
Yeah,
Because
assuming the Adeline is
Stormseeker.
made unable to block, I don't think that Samantha is going to be able to survive that.
Right, because Adeline is unable to block. Any Spellbinder can only provide 1 toughness. Does the Stormcharge Seeker have its own trample?
It does not, but
Okay.
even with the Hopeful Initiate going on the Stormcharge Seeker, with the Falconrat Pit Fighter and the Goblin also coming in and only being able to block 2 creatures, Samantha is going to be taking at least, I believe, 6 damage in this spot.
Yeah, it looks like you are right. And there we go. Turn them all sideways. Get it in. And Caroline taking out the first game with mono red aggro thanks to those Reckless Stormseekers. And just a combination of very annoying little creatures to overwhelm the mono white deck. So we are going to go into sideboarding now. What's your approach if you're in the mono white?
From the mono white side, well, this is one of the rewards to Caroline for bringing something like mono red, which is perhaps a less well-known and expected deck, because there's really not a lot of options in the mono white sideboard that line up all that well. Something like Guardians of Fate do some work because they do blank removal spells at points, but and then they'd blank something like Syndicalism. But at the same time, the 3/2 stat line, not great against a deck with Play with Fire. So one way or another, Samantha's gonna have some cards that don't line up all that well against what Caroline's doing.
Caroline's sideboard, meanwhile, looks really sweet. So a couple of extra removal spells coming in, a couple of Goldspan Dragons coming in as well. Get rid of this Alchemist Gambit, sad face. Get rid of some of these Chandras, double sad face, but certainly ends up with a very effective looking mono red list against the white deck.
Yeah, particularly with this version of white, it's maybe a little lower to the ground with things like Codespell Cleric. The ability to just board into a game plan in the mid game that has access to Syndicalism and just a few slightly larger threats is going to do an excellent job going over the mono white deck, assuming there aren't a bunch of Legion Angels drawn.
So Caroline also on the mulligan decides to keep this one a little bit bare of threats, but does have a Spikefield Hazard and a Dragon's Fire and a Burning Hand, so can at least answer 3 of the first threats that Samantha can put out.
Yeah, and this start, though, with the Initiate and the Cleric is a little annoying for Caroline because the Initiate is threatening to grow to 3 toughness next turn itself, so be able to already dodge Syndicalism, Burning Hands, things like that. And assuming Caroline does spend actual removal spells on this creature, well, then there's the risk that the Luminarch Aspirant coming in a turn or 2 just takes over the game.
It really has to think about how to sequence these 2-mana removal spells. Reckless Stormseeker, which was so good for Caroline in game number 1, joining the party as well. No 3rd land for Samantha, but does find a Brutal Cather, which is actually in an interesting position, I think, against mono red, because on the one hand, removing their creatures and getting your own creature is great. But on the other hand, they have a lot of burn.
Yeah, it's actually something that lines up slightly better post-board than it does game 1, maybe. In game 1, there's not huge creatures to remove, and you're not generally getting a huge advantage when you get rid of something for a turn and then it just gets removed. But post-board, with things like Moonveil Regent all staying in, things like Goldspan Dragon coming in, sometimes the Brutal Cather can just remove a really big blocker and let the mono-white deck get ahead for a turn, and that's all that matters.
Yeah, and another thing that's pretty interesting is that red, relying on all of these instant speed effects like Dragon's Fire and the such, you can there's some day-night shenanigans that you can get up to if you're the mono white player, but we're gonna see Brutal Kappa be horribly engulfed in the flames from the dragon's fire on Caroline's side.
Yeah, and even though Caroline isn't building up a bot advantage because these 1/1s from the den are going to be eaten, isn't getting in for all that much damage. As the game goes later and later, it does tend to favor her more. And there's just really not that many good draws Samantha has in this spot.
Usher of the Fallen will at least allow a double spell. Get max value out of this cleric. Thinking about where to put this counter. It doesn't make the most sense on the Usher because you can train the Hopeful Initiate the next turn.
Yeah, being able to flip back Caroline's Werewolf is also useful. It means the Den is perhaps not threatening attacks for quite as much damage. It's not quite as scary a blocker, but Caroline's still going to have the ability to control the day-night cycle a lot by just opting not to cast spells on future turns and flipping into night without really giving Samantha the ability to double spell. And that ends up really strong, not only because it flips Caroline's Stormseeker, but also because it means Brutal Katas off the top for Samantha are no longer removal because they don't have an Enters the Battlefield trigger on the night side.
That's a good point. All right, so both players with not a lot going on in hand, just a couple of lands to hold on to, but Caroline certainly with the scarier board presence. It's going to be a big attack in. Samantha pretty content to keep trading off with these lands, but just not really an answer insight to that Stormshard Seeker. I wonder if Samantha brought copies of Valorous Stance in.
That seems possible, but it's hard to know going in whether the mono red deck is how much bigger the mono red deck is going to go, and whether they're looking to bring in something like Goldspan Dragon. Because if they're not, then Valorous Stance not the best card.
Legion Angel, what a draw for Samantha. We were talking about this one during sideboarding / before the match, and wow, just exactly what Samantha is looking for. Holds down the Stormcharge Seeker, can start getting in because you know, of course, that you have a second copy, you have a third copy even in the sideboard to get. And all of a sudden, just with that one draw, Samantha looking like she's turning the corner here. Play with fire. What can that do?
Well, it's an interesting spot here because Caroline could attack with the Stormcharge Slasher, right? And at this point, Samantha knows Caroline's just going to be attacking no matter what because she's dead otherwise. And if Samantha had opted not to block there to try and get lethal on the following turn, then the play with fire might have ended up being lethal on its own. So that's didn't end up happening.
Yeah, I mean, you've certainly got to try, I think, if you're Caroline in that spot.
The other thing the play with fire might do is there might be another one drawn next turn.
Oh, okay, all right. So there are outs. There are outs for sure for Caroline. And Samantha, you know, it's easy for Samantha. All she has to do is attack. Oh, here we go. Yeah. Play with fire. Get the scry.
I believe another
Stormseeker on top.
I believe that's also lethal here because it's still nighttime.
Night?
That would be 3/4 that becomes a 5/4 with trample, and there's only 3 toughness of blockers for Samantha.
What? Oh my god! This game has been incredible. There it is, Stormcharge Seeker, the night side of Reckless Stormseeker off the top. 2 points of trample going through, and Caroline Kavanagh, Trump player luck, just pulling it out the bag as she does. Perfect. Wow. How does she do it? Incredible stuff from Mono Red, and yeah, great games for both players. You know, it did look sketchy there in game number 2 for Caroline with with those Legion Angels being drawn, but wow, that Reckless Stormseeker, really MVP of the match, Reckless Stormseeker.
Very much so, and it highlights a weakness again of these white, various colored aggressive decks, is that if your opponent's an aggressive deck who's just going ever so slightly bigger than you, then a lot of the threats are just going to kind of fail in comparison. We saw the Vampires deck trying to take advantage of that. The Mono Red deck does a pretty similar job. It might not have as much good removal as the Vampires deck. No, its board wipes might not be as devastating, but it also does a better job being able to actually close out the game against more controlling decks, and certainly has an advantage against aggressive decks like Mono White.
Yeah, very nice indeed. Okay, so we're gonna see Caroline, I believe, improve to 3-1 in this season of the VML, making a nice run to challenge for a third potential VML title, which is, of course, just insane to think about. And Arya, you and I are going to have a look at our fourth feature match of the evening. And we have a pretty sweet one going all the way up to Division 2. We have Zabracus on Jund Midrange, which is a deck pretty close to my heart. Jaspera Sentinel, Magda, but with some cool new cards from Crimson Vow.
Yeah, this is another one of those decks that it's hard to quite know whether it's going to be good enough to cut it or not. It's got a bunch of new cards from Crimson Vow with this, with the Sorin and Cemetery Prowler, I believe. Just being slight upgrades to previous threats and previous threats in the mid-range slots for the deck. And all the good interaction from before, all Goldspan Dragon, of course, performing an incredibly important role in this deck, and just slight upgrades to the threats in the mid game may or may not end up making this deck good enough to compete. It remains to be seen.
Yeah, I'm just having a quick look through the list. I will say, Instant Predator, incredible. Sorin, yet to be convinced, I think, from my side of the battlefield, but yeah, we'll see how it goes here for Zabracus. Let's have a look at what she is playing against. He is back, Monsieur Pinchy, back again to steal your baguettes and also potentially steal the game with just the absolute raw power level of this card can't really be overstated.
Yeah, and we talk about Horror sealing the game. Well, if there's any deck in which Horror is going to do that, it's this one. This is perhaps the most reliant on Horror, but also the most able to really utilize Horror to its full potential. There's 4 copies of Horror, which is a lot, and full 4 copies of Unexpected Windfall, and 1 Celestis to ramp into it. And there's a full 8 1-mana spells to ensure that once the Horror is out, you're often going to be able to just get rid of your opponent's entire board and also any way they have of interacting with you.
Okay, so this is the full-on, like 100% lean-in version of Hullbreaker Horror. That's what you're saying.
Yeah, that's at least what it seems to look like. There's only 1 egg in 2 layers as the other threat. There's not multiple eggs. There's not Goldspan Dragons in the main. It really is all in on Hullbreaker Horror. I'm not entirely sure how this deck would win without it, so I expect we'll see it cost a bunch this match.
All right, well, let's find out. We are going to have a really nice mid-range versus control. Jund, Magda, Jund Treasures going up against Izzet, and we are watching from the point of view of Zabracus. This hand is looking real nice. Prosperous Innkeeper, Magda, Instant Predator, Goldspan Dragon, and Cemetery Prowler, all, exactly the kind of curve that you are looking for.
Yeah, it's a pretty strong curve. The lack of Jaspera Sentinel is a little rough in this matchup. Mid-range decks, we talked about these slightly go over the top of aggro decks, mid-range decks being not super well situated against a deck like Izzet Control, which just goes over the top of them so well. So you really want as much acceleration as you can get. But that said, Innkeeper puts in work, and Magda is a threat they have to answer really quickly. So it's definitely not a bad hand.
Just to give you a bit of an update, Looter Scooter is currently undefeated in Division 2. Zabracus climbing her way up from 1 and 2, of course, as we discussed before. Certainly hopes for the season not dead at 1 and 2. Still several weeks to go here for both of these players.
Yep, and I mean, with a hand like this out of the Jund control deck, you really, the Jund midrange deck, you really want to punish the blue-red deck for stumbling. That's ideally what you do. Make them have a removal spell for your Magda, make them have a removal spell for all your big threats coming after that. And with Luda being on a multi-5, it's definitely a hand that's perhaps slightly more likely to stumble than most might be out of the Izzet control deck.
Haunted Ridge, the perfect draw there for Zabracus, means that she can deploy Prosperous Innkeeper and know that Instant Predator can come down the very next turn if she wants it to, and have a creature ready to be sacrificed to it.
Yeah, and some really smart and heads-up play there from Zabracus, not playing out the Magda on 2, instead going for the Innkeeper. Even though the Magda is the more potent threat, Luda Scooter had priority on turn 1 with a Spike Field Hazard being left up, because that's the only spell for a single red in her deck. So using that knowledge, Zabracus was able to play out the Innkeeper instead of the Magda and prevent creating her turn 2 for Luda Scooter's turn 1, letting Luda Scooter perhaps get a little ahead that way.
So we are going to see Spikefield Hazard trade with Magda, but a turn later. And we still Zabracus actually choose to prioritize the possibility of getting Goldspan Dragon out this turn instead of the Predator from the previous turn.
Yeah, another card that should be a consideration for Zabracus here would be Jawari Disruption. There's 3 copies of that in Luda Scooter's deck, and again, with Luda Scooter on a multi-5, you want to give her the absolute minimum chance of turning spell lands like Spikefield Hazard and Divide by Zero and Jawari Disruption into actual cards, and instead making them just more lands, allowing the Jund deck to get ahead on cards.
So tested the waters there with Cemetery Prowler. That was sent back to hand with Divide by Zero, and Zabracus just content to kind of sit back a little bit, play around these Jawari disruptions. There's also a copy of Syncopate in the deck as well. And just kind of ride the card advantage, the natural card advantage from not having Mulligan for now.
Yeah, and the Jaspera Sentinel here actually in a pretty good draw, despite not being the most threatening. Sentinel is just another threat that can be run out without playing into Disruption. On future turns, it's going to make Disruption much less likely to actually impact what Zabracus plays. It's, of course, very good with Immerstem Predator, allowing Zabracus to just put counters on it, and is also just another creature. While a small creature, most creatures are just really impactful at this spot just because they keep the Immerstem Predator alive.
So Cemetery Prowler exiled Divide by Zero, which makes, I believe, instants now cheaper for Zabracus to cast. Would have liked to have exiled a creature, but the Magda that was removed was actually sent to the exile zone already thanks to Spikefield Hazard. So no option to exile a creature, but does now have an instant and sorcery under that Prowler.
Yeah, and while the purpose of that exiling is generally for the cost reduction, it's worth noting that Luda Scooter's deck is one with 2 Leas in it, so eating away at her graveyard, exiling those impactful instants and sorceries, definitely also threatening Luta's ability to play the long game.
That is Syncopate, one of my favorite counter spells, and as you know, Arya, I am somewhat of a connoisseur. I keep them all in like a little butterfly case, just pinned there neatly in a row.
Well,
occasionally I get them out to admire them. And then I play Thalia in the VML.
Know thy enemy, I guess. And a little awkward. You mentioned that creature discount off of exiling creatures, but the syncopate, the second threat from second answer from Luda Scooter, again just exiling another one of Zabracus's threats, preventing her from having a creature in the graveyard, while at the same time putting yet another instant or sorcery in the graveyard that could maybe at some point be useful with Leah, though syncopate perhaps slightly less useful with Leah than some other instants and sorceries.
What's your favorite counter spell?
Oh, that's a tough question.
Yeah.
Does Divide by Zero count?
That's what you get on the VML stream. The hard-hitting interviews, where the Vox Populi just try to figure out what the experts are thinking.
I think it's got to be either Test of Talent or Disdainful Stroke. They're both really elegant designs that fill a certain niche in a given metagame and have the potential to be really, really powerful or completely unplayable.
Okay, so you like the situational counter spells.
Yeah, you won't find me endorsing
mana
original
drains.
counter spell.
No mana drains for Arya. Spell Snare, don't need that. Well, actually, sure. What about Spell Snare?
Spell Snare's a conditional, but I haven't really played that much Modern, so I haven't, at least not at points where it was playable, so I haven't gotten much chance to play it, and it's from before my time in Standard.
Spell Snare is really sweet. Okay, so Fading Hope sends back the Cemetery Prowler. Those cards don't come back. They just stayed exiled forever. And Zabracus has just not been very good at drawing lands, but has been quite good at chipping in for just a couple of points of damage here and there on Luta Scooter, who is down to 8 already.
And here's a Sentinel, like we mentioned, preventing Jawari Disruption from being something that could hit Goldspan Dragon, even though Zabracus is a little constrained on mana otherwise. And this Goldspan Dragon in turn is likely to net Zabracus at least some mana. So if it enters play and gets answered, then Zabracus may end up able to cast the Valky and maybe nab a Hullbreaker Horror that couldn't be played this turn because the 7th land entered tapped.
Unexpected Windfall, doing what it does best. Just saving the game for Izzet players everywhere.
Yeah, notably discarding a Jawari Disruption that Zabracus was really rewarded for playing around.
Yeah, really excellent playing around of Jawari Disruption there. Divide by Zero sends Goldspan Dragon back to hand, teaching the Archaics the draw.
And yeah, even though we saw Luda Scooter multi-5 here, it looks like she's starting to actually get ahead on cards with all these lands, the teaching to drop to 6, and as long as she's able to survive these next few turns, now that she's up on cards, regardless of the low life total, the Izzet deck does have an edge in the late game thanks to just how powerful Horror is, and particularly with Zabracus being stuck on 4 lands, 5 now. If the next few turns can be weathered, Luda Scooter looks to be in pretty good shape.
So this time, Goldspan Dragon does get to hit the battlefield. There's no Hullbreaker Horror mana up yet, because it does cost 7. Dragon sent back to hand, and attack in for 3. Luta is down to just 2 life. Is there any random bit of burn or anything in this deck? It's just 3 Reckless Stormseekers and 4 Goldspan Dragons in terms of haste.
Yeah, I don't believe there's any incidental burn in this list, so we're definitely at a point where something like Hullbreaker Horror coming down, stabilizing the board will probably be enough for Luda Scooter, but without that, Luda Scooter will just die by virtue of being a 2 life.
Okay, so here's the Hullbreaker Horror. Now we're gonna see just the the way that this card absolutely dominates the battlefield every time it comes down. Fading Hope is now both gonna send the spell back to hand and send away one of these threats. Loot does go down to 1. You know, all of these threats are now lethal, but with 2 cards in hand and getting to untap. You know, if Looter doesn't have anything, this...
Yeah. It is easy for the Izzet decks to run out of cards in this spot. That used to seldom happen as a result of Galvanic iteration, allowing you to draw a lot of cards with something like Unexpected Windfall. But right now, the deck doesn't have all that much card advantage, so it's certainly possible that Looter Scooter just runs out of spells.
They're not today. A braid. Oh my goodness. This Hellbreaker Horror is just crazy. What a card. Why did they print this card?
I can't say
literally
no
run the
answer.
whole gamut of emotions. Like from it's a big lobster, Monsieur the Pinchy, to like, okay, this card is the real deal.
Yeah, I wouldn't be surprised if a few weeks or months from now it ends up in a similar spot to Alrund's Epiphany was, where people just find it maybe a little too oppressive to be happy in seeing play.
All right, well, oh my goodness, there it is, Goldspan Dragon coming down and flying over. So Looter Scooter did not have another instant speed spell to deploy, and Zabracus eking that one out over Hullbreaker Horror. That was incredibly well played there by Zabracus, playing around the Jawari disruption for so many turns and ultimately just about getting over the line with that Goldspan Dragon. Great stuff in game number 1.
Yeah, it's definitely a weakness of these Izzet control shells that have popped up as compared to the previous Epiphany shells, with not really much late game reach. They don't get the opportunity to play things like Memory Deluge, or Behold the Multiverses, because there's only so many slots in the deck, and there's no Galvanic iterations to just draw a ton of cards over several turns. So mid-range decks are more able to keep up with them than they were with the previous turn shells.
All right, Arya, I'm gonna ask you for your opinion on Lolth Spider Queen.
I'm gonna have to be honest with you. I'm not a fan of the card.
Yeah, I knew you weren't a fan. That's why I asked. I played Jund Treasures in week number 2, and I have to say I really like Jund Treasures, but I did also feel that Lolth was the weak spot in the deck, if that could be described to be a weak spot.
Yeah,
This hand is looking pretty mono green for Zabracus, but has a lot of Jaspera Sentinels in it. Like
there's certainly going to be a lot of mana made relatively quickly.
Wow, actually goes for the 3rd one instead of the Innkeeper here. It's pretty understandable.
Yeah, we saw how important just chipping in over and over several turns can be last game, and Zabracus recognizing that, choosing to go with like the line that allows her to get in some damage, allows her to get out the full 3 creatures, and leaves her in like a pretty decent spot going forward.
So this is actually pretty nice, because this line means that Zabracus could play the Innkeeper this turn, and next turn play the Dragon. It should everything survive. Next turn play the Dragon, and the treasure is already there for the mana to be doubled. It's pretty sweet.
She also had the option this spot to go for the go blank if she wanted to, so she gave herself that flexibility by tapping 2 of the Sentinels and by tapping all of the Sentinels in the Innkeeper with that 1 layer. She opted not to, going for damage instead, but leaving herself that opening to do that, definitely really powerful in a matchup like this, where if there were some early answers deployed, then trying to fight a card advantage battle may have been a good tactic for.
So let's have a look at what Luta has going on in the sideboard. 2 Burning Hands, 2 Cinderclasm, 2 Goldspan Dragon of her own, 2 Disdainful Stroke. So not a lot of, like, no Burn Down the House, no Battle of Frost and Fire, like, no big sweepers.
No, there's definitely
Luta.
been a lean away from that because, as we saw in our very first match today, the mono white deck does a good job taxing that. So you're incentivized to go a little lower to the ground with your sweepers with something like Cinderclasm. But the deck does that's also helped by the fact that the deck just has Hullbreaker Horror. So by turn 5, you often don't need to wipe the board. You can just play out the horror and win the game.
So Go Blank snags a couple of copies of Unexpected Windfall. Zabracus is going to stay on the same plan that she was on in game number 1, which is I have a bunch of 1/1s, and they're going to be an annoyingly fast clock if you don't do anything about them. Holding on to this Goldspan Dragon for, the last push.
Yeah. And at this point, what it's really going to come down to is whether Luta has a threat, which it appears she does.
Well, Leah is a threat, but in the graveyard right now, there is only a Fading Hope.
Yeah, though that...
Is that because Fading Hope does let you bounce Lair of the Hydra?
Yeah.
Because it's the creature one?
Possibly even more importantly, in addition to bouncing something like Goldspan, it lets Luta threaten the ability to bounce the lair itself. So if Zabracus were to find a removal spell instead of the Goldspan this turn, the lair could survive for another turn and could be a potential way of taking over the game a few turns down the line.
Would you ever just throw away a Sentinel for 3 damage?
I think that's gonna be unlikely to work out with the lair currently in play, just because a lot of your creatures are just gonna get incidentally picked away by removal spells with the lair sticking around.
Go Blank is quite a nice draw, although Zabracus probably wishes that Auto Tapper hadn't quite tapped like that.
Yeah, it's not a huge downside because there's going to need to be 2 mana made from Treasure and the Sentinel anyway to cast a Goldspan Dragon. So the color restrictions here on most things aren't all that relevant.
Okay, so a couple of lands, Cinderclasm, they get exiled away. Now it's time. Goldspan Dragon, once again. This one cannot be countered. So the only type of interaction we might see from Luta is, a Divide by 0, or something like another Fading Hope, Demon Bolt, also a possibility.
Yeah, and these Fading Hopes in conjunction with Leia quite good, but notably not actually answering this Goldspan. And putting Luta down 1 card every single time they're played. So a little awkward in terms of actually getting ahead in the long game.
How about Valky, God of Lies? For some late game power.
That's definitely pretty scary. We spoke about the Ilya giving Luda Scooter the ability to play a good late game, but Valky kills Leia and is a very credible threat for Zabracus all in one when played on the Tybalt side. So definitely one of the better draws in her deck.
Goldspan Dragon down once again. Just hovering there menacingly. Oh, speaking of hovering there menacingly, surprise!
Yeah,
it's
and
back again.
What's really powerful about Horror in this spot is that the ability isn't a spell, so it can target Goldspan Dragon and not give Zabracus that all-important extra mana, not allowing her to work up towards doing something like casting Goldspan and Tybalt in the same turn. Instead, continuing to tax her mana a little bit, and every spell is going to be basically a time walk, bouncing a Goldspan Dragon or a Tybalt for the next several turns.
Basically, a time walk has been called. It's that time of the evening. You know, the cast has been round the block a couple times, maybe a couple. It's getting close to midnight for you, at least. And
Yeah. I would like to actually
trying to
issue
make
a
some
correction.
outlandish claims.
I would like to issue a correction with the Leah. Every spell is basically 2 time walks because you can flash it back and do the same thing again the next time.
Production, security. Can we can we get her out the building? Yeah, I do feel like it's a little bit of a broken record at this point. Like, I feel like I've been here before with Zabracus, but you know, you gotta hand it to Zabracus. Like, a lot of patience being shown here. Can take a couple of hits from this Hullbreaker. That's not a problem.
Yeah, again, that lack of guard advantage, meaning there's not maybe Luda's whole body getting bounced anytime soon.
Here's Tybalt, and that, of course, is a spell that can be returned to hand with Fading Hope on one of these small, let's just call them dorks.
Yeah, and you didn't believe in the double time walk of every spell, but I mean, here we saw Fading Hope just trade straight for 2 of Zabracus's turns.
I mean, you're not, like, it's annoying because you're not like 100% wrong, which is kind of ironic because usually, like, that's how I like to operate, like, not 100% wrong.
Uh-huh.
So I respect it. I respect the hustle. I also respect the horror. Just jamming in. Let's go.
Yeah, horror plus Leah is pretty terrifying.
I mean, just what can Zabracus do? It just feels like a lock.
Yeah, we know there's 3 spells in hand. I suppose they could all be more horrors, which would be uncastable in this spot.
They could be more horrors. Unfortunately, they are just divide by zeros.
Yeah, divide by 0 plus Leah is such a disgusting interaction. Just having the ability to, even when spells can't be countered, essentially counter your opponent's spells for free from your graveyard feels very strong.
Hey, and you get to bounce a thing. I feel like a carousel horse trapped, you know, around the maypole, just unable to get off. That's how I feel right now. Empathetically for Zabracus.
Yeah, we're reaching the end of the time period which Zabracus was drawing to live outs. There was a little bit where perhaps a well-timed removal spell could have been recast a few times to kill the horror, but it's not even going to be the case for long.
I wonder if it would have been, instead of casting 1 spell each turn for Zabracus, that, you know, trying to multi-spell would have been a little bit more helpful. It's hard to say.
I think the worry in this spot is just that with the Lier as a 3-4 and the horror as a 7-8, Luda Scooter might just have been able to completely ignore extra spells that were cast.
Oh my goodness. The second horror? Oh my god. And use that to bounce the spell, and now every spell you can bounce 2 things? This is too much.
Just playing out the Chariot had an unfortunate downside of revealing every card in Zabracus's hand to Luda Scooter, which means there's no more need to play around a removal spell, which means just running out the horror is completely safe.
Yeah, it's not legendary. There are multiple of these. It has no name. It's just simply an anonymous denizen of the deep. Just waiting in the depths to ruin your day. Like, it just spots someone on the shoreline having a picnic out with their family and says, nope, I'm no permanents for you, no spells for you. Here comes the team, and we are gonna see Luta Scooter even things up here in our final feature match of the evening against Zabracus. 1 game apiece as we go back to the sideboard.
Yeah, and there's something particularly something that really drains the hope with Hullbreaker Horror as opposed to something like Alrund's Epiphany, with it being in play, and you're having the knowledge that maybe they won't have a spell this time. Maybe you can resolve something and just turn after turn after turn getting your spell bounced, but you have to keep playing because you never know quite when they'll run out. There's something particularly draining about that for me.
You can't even pithing needle it. I was just trying to, like, in my mind, run through what possible answers there are.
No? Perhaps the best answer.
They should make a pithing needle that does all abilities.
Perhaps the best answer to it might be to bounce it while on the stack with your Hullbreaker Horror.
Oh my goodness. I think the best answer is probably just player removal. Right? That's something what Zabracus would prefer.
Well, yes.
Going into game 3 on the play. This is a great hand though. Just Spare Sentinel into Magda, into Chariot, into Predator or Dragon is exactly what you want to be.
Yeah, I believe that Zabracus can actually next turn go Goldspan Dragon and Essica's Chariot, given the Magda plus Sentinel mana.
Yeah, but assuming there's no, assuming there's no, like, wait, there can't even be Syncopate, right? Oh, there we go. Disdainful Stroke. That takes care of the dragon. Oh, Luda Scooter missed a land drop. And here's Innocent Predator. Oh my goodness, a second Disdainful Stroke. Okay. One more threat in hand for Zabracus. Can start getting it in this turn. Let's see this. Okay, there's 2 Disdainful Strokes in Luta's deck. And Zabracus knows this. It's open deckless. Test of Talons that doesn't care about Chariot. Here we go. Essex Chariot, and Zabracus could actually also play Reckless Stormseeker. Give the Chariot haste this very turn.
Yeah, and that's pretty scary in this spot. There's not really an easy way to answer that on 2 mana. Something like Fading Hope is just going to put Luda Scooter down on cards, and is not going to prevent it just being replayed next turn. The Esca Chariot's going to keep generating an advantage.
Okay.
Yeah.
Interesting.
I think Zabracus may have.
Okay, I see what happened. Zabracus used the Chariot to create an extra mana from Magda, which helps play around Syncopate and leaves open the attack from the Jaspera Sentinel.
Yeah, though she ended up not giving the Chariot haste with Stormseeker, which might have allowed her to get a little further ahead by just making another token. But it does also play a little bit into something like Fading Hope, bouncing the Chariot, allowing for potentially a counterspell on it next turn. Whereas this way, with giving the Stormseeker haste, at least if the Chariot's getting bounced, Zabracus is getting in a bunch of damage, and then there's pressure to play a spell main phase for Luda to avoid the Reckless Stormseeker flipping, and she's just generally in not great shape at this point.
Right. And if you're in Zabracus, you're so far ahead, your opponent's missing land drops, you just need to kill them. The age-old question of how could I possibly lose this game is going to be creeping up in your head. And I think Zabracus, certainly a very experienced competitor, well aware of these considerations.
Yeah, I think the most likely way for Zabracus to actually have the ability to lose this game would involve a Cinderclasm in conjunction with some other removal spells, maybe something like that, allowing Luda Scooter to get rid of most of the board and just maybe survive a little bit more and get to that mid game where she has 7 cards in hand to Zabracus's 1. But right now, she's looking pretty far behind.
It's divide by 0 for now on the chariot. Goes down to 5, and it's gonna have to be something pretty special here for Lutus Kutu. Unfortunately, not really finding the mana that she needed in game number 3. Zabracus with the perfect curve out, Sentinel into Magda, in to multiple dragons and chariot, and Lutus Kutu just has to pass the turn back with all of the mana available. And says, you still got to play this one out. You still got to close this one out, Zabracus.
Yeah, there's still the possibility of something like Fading Hope plus Syndiclasm, but save for a very specific combination of cards like that. I'd imagine Zabracus has got this.
There we go. You see the good games being offered by Lutus Scooter, and it is Zabracus who is going to take down this clash in Division 2 with Jund Treasures winning out over Izzet Control. Wow, what a great matchup there, and extremely well played by Zabracus. You can see that she's had experience with this deck and really was thinking about all the cards she could possibly lose to, all the cards she could play around. Great stuff.
Yep, and a strong showing for the Jund deck, showing that even if it was a little soft to the Alrund's Epiphany decks from before because they could just go over the top, having a bunch of interaction for this blue-red deck with less guard advantage and having these improved threats with things like Sorin might give the deck the ability to compete with the more late-game control decks that it didn't have before.
Yeah. I'm actually secretly at heart a big fan of the Jund deck. So it's really nice to see, and really nice to see some deck diversity in the format as well. Mono white, of course, still strong, but we saw Mardu Vampires look pretty reasonable. We saw Jund, we saw mono red in the hands of Caroline doing its thing, turning them sideways. And of course, at the top end of the curve, we saw the Izzet and Dimir control decks with just the raw power, raw card advantage, and raw despair inducing, time walkness offered by the combination of Lear and Hullbreaker Horror. So overall, a great week for Arya. And what are we looking forward to in the coming weeks?
Definitely looking to see more of what these mid-range strategies actually end up looking like. Maybe looking a little to see what people bring to attack a more solve-looking meta after the championships next week. What decks emerge as the top contenders, and what cards from Crimson Vow that maybe haven't had the chance to shine so far can be used in some slightly more unconventional strategies to try and attack the metagame rather than just be a good deck at the start of a format.
Yeah, certainly. Okay, well, that's going to do it from myself and from Arya this evening. Thank you so much for sticking with us. We saw some awesome magic, and we will be back next week here at exactly the same time, 6 p.m. Pacific, 9 p.m. Eastern. Thank you to Wizards of the Coast, our sponsor. Thank you to Nerd Rage Gaming, our WPN store partner. You can follow us on Twitter at VMLMTG. You can go to VMLMTG.com if you want to take a sneak peek and check out who's playing in what division and what all the standings are. All the information there at VMLMTG.com. And of course, we are here at twitch.tv/VMLMTG every Friday. Arya, thank you for joining me. How should people find you if they want to get in touch with you?
You can find me on Twitter, Twitch, anywhere else as hogbog_98. And yeah, that's about it.
Yeah, same with me. Not same with me. You can't find me as hogbog_98. You can find me on Twitter and Twitch at Nifette, NIPHETTE. And if you want to get in touch with me, just let me know. And if you want to follow me on Twitter for shit posts about whether a card should be called Monsieur Le Pinchy or not, just saying, that's the place to go. All right, thank you, my friends. Thank you for tuning in today. We will see you next time on the VML. Until then, stay safe, good luck, and have fun. See you later.